My friends, according to Forbes, for the first time since 2022, Ukraine might have a tank advantage over Russia. You will quickly see throughout this video how this statement is completely out of touch with reality. Actually, here's a little preview. Those are your average Russian armored columns storming Ukrainian positions, and now let's check for Ukraine.
Shameful display!
With that being said, today we will talk about the battle for the Kurakhove salient, where despite a strenuous situation, Ukraine prevented a complete military debacle. In early November, Ukraine held a 60-kilometer front between Pokrovsk and Velika Novosilka, but with the Russian offensive towards Pokrovsk, combined with the one from the South Donetsk direction, the Ukrainian army was slowly getting enveloped into a cauldron both from the north and the south. Just like Ukrainian military expert Serhiy Kuzan told Union, the enemy is trying to get into our rear in order to cut off logistics. That's right, if the Russians pushed deeper, the entire situation could have turned into a messy excursion. Nearly 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers were about to be surrounded and captured by the enemy. This military debacle could have very well ended the war for Ukraine. Actually, in January 2015, the AFU faced a very similar situation in Debaltseve. During this Battle of Debaltseve, the Ukrainians also held a 60-kilometer front surrounded on three sides. But after 1 month of relentless attacks on the flanks, the cauldron collapsed. The AFU had to retreat in a hurry, under enemy fire, and suffered catastrophic losses during the escape. Yet this time around, the Ukrainian command learned from its mistakes, held the line, and prevented a complete collapse of the pocket. That was the situation on November 1st at the beginning of the battle, then again on December 1st, culminating 1 month later on January 1st, and this is the situation now. This retrograde maneuver by the AFU was skillfully carried out, especially since one mistake and it was GG well played. It was a very complex operation, since they could never catch a break. Russian assault detachments were always at the tip of the spear, storming enemy outposts and fortifications with small tactical units inserted right onto trench bastions. Overall, from the perspective of the general staff of the AFU, the goal was twofold: withdraw in good order and slow down enemy forces as much as possible. Essentially what we call a fighting retreat, in order to give enough time for the engineers at the rear to build a new set of fortifications. The withdrawal required perfect coordination between units. While some troops held defensive nodes, others dropped them to reposition a couple kilometers behind. As you can see on the map, the Ukrainians had a lot of fortifications in the region, east of Ilivka, all around Uspenivka, along the Sukhiyali River, around Dalnie, plus this large defensive belt east and south of Kurakhove. From the Russian perspective, it was definitely a tough nut to crack. The objective was to maneuver around these fortified bastions in order to avoid being bogged down. In the end, during this 2.5-month battle, the Russian armed forces completely exhausted their reserves of flags. If you're wondering how I keep up with all the political news related to the Ukraine war, it's because I use this app and website called Ground News for my research. I found this interesting story. Kremlin welcomes the possibility of a meeting between Trump and Putin. Ground News found nearly 100 articles covering this story. It immediately tells us that 42% of the sources lean politically on the right and 34% to the left, but that 70% of them are highly factual. As you can see, this is a great tool for my research. You can also access Ground News by using my link ground.news/HistoryLegends to access the Vantage plan. That's the one I use and they're offering 40% off right now. One of my favorite features of Ground News is the bias comparison tool. If you're in a rush, with one simple click, you can get a summary of what both the left and the right are reporting on for the same story. Here we learn that the left is emphasizing Trump's potential to end the war, while the center expresses skepticism about his rapid resolution claims. As for the right, it portrays Putin's openness to dialogue as favorable but shows Ukrainian officials dismissing this stance. Another feature that I like is the bias distribution tool. that allows you to see the political leaning of various news sources. With ground news, you can also filter through all these sources. Let's say I want an article that is politically at the center with high or very high factuality and no paywall so that I can read it easily. Perfect, we got 8 articles to choose from. Personally, as someone fascinated by warfare and geopolitics, ground news is an invaluable tool that cuts through the noise. Ground news is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. That's the one I use, and it will only be available for a limited time. If you're already a subscriber, you can send ground news as a gift for 40% off as well. So make sure you use my link in the description below. I think ground news is doing important work and I hope you'll check them out. Not only will you support the headquarters, but you'll also support a small team looking to hold the media accountable. I think the best way to cover the Kurakhove battle is really to go through a step-by-step analysis, so that you can get the full picture both on the operational level and also as we zoom in on the tactical level. November 2024. On the 2nd of November, the town of Kurakhivka fell. It's located a couple kilometers northeast of Kurakhove across the reservoir. Meanwhile, that day, Russian columns advanced 2.5 kilometers south of the village of Maximilianivka. So right off the bat, we can have an idea of the Russian plan. One pincer would follow the reservoir on the northern side, while another one would attack on the southern side of the reservoir and go straight for Kurakhove. By the 4th of November, the Russians had mopped up this entire area southwest of Kurakhivka, cleared Ostrivske, and they were now at the gates of Ilinka. Here you can see how soldiers of the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade raised their banner on the village of Vovchenka, as well as on the hamlet of Stepanivka on the northern banks of the Kurakhove reservoir. At the same time, forward elements also pushed south of Tsukurine. If the Russian army continued at this pace, the Ukrainian command would once again have to deal with a cauldron. If we look south of Kurakhove, the Russian army had 4 spearheads pushing north towards the Sukhiyali River. The general staff of the AFU faced a situation similar to these Russian dolls. You would have one big cauldron, inside it you would have a smaller one, inside it you would have, yet again, a smaller cauldron. By the 5th of November, this entire 8-kilometer sector south of Maximilianivka fell into the gray zone, meaning heavy fighting took place there. From an operational perspective, the Russian command maneuvered to advance as far as possible and avoid these fortified trench bastions that would naturally take a lot of time and manpower to eliminate. Meanwhile, south of Kurakhove, Russian forces stormed this forested area north of Bohoyavlenka. The next day, on the 6th, another 1,600-meter push along this tree line in Maximivka. And 24 hours later, the Ukrainians were forced to abandon 8.5 square kilometers of ground. Further to the east, Russian units mopped up this entire tree line in order to prepare their attack on the village of Yelizavetivka. Heavy firefights were now taking place in the village of Ilinka. Ilinka north of the reservoir and not Ilinka south of Kurakhove. I know it's very confusing for everyone. I mean, props to Ukrainian postal services. I don't know how they did it. In this video, we see a Ukrainian tank pointing its cannon straight at the enemy and releasing its load at point blank. Because once again, due to the lack of infantry, the Ukrainian command can only send armored vehicles for hit-and-run fire missions. It's still crazy to me to see that tanks that were made to have a range of multiple kilometers end up being used to blast away enemies at point blank, not even 50 meters ahead. Now the Ukrainian army witnessed its first very bad day of the Kurakhove battle on the 8th of November. Just take a look at all the ground the Ukrainians had to abandon. The most worrying was this 3.5 kilometer blitz towards Dalnie, which threatened to cut this cauldron in two and trap about 2,500 Ukrainian soldiers. For a country already short on manpower, this would be a disaster. Another sector to pay close attention to was this 2-kilometer push west of Maximivka, because the Russians were now only one Tetris move away from the village of Sukhiyali. In that case, it's GG well played for the entire Ukraine grouping. Might as well prepare the tic-tac-toe games that they will play in Russian prison camps. After this dark day, the following one was equally as bad. Ukrainian forces had to quickly abandon all these tree lines that were marked as part of the gray zone. The Russians had effectively secured all the positions around Maximilianivka. Yeah, so Maximilianivka, not to be confused with Maximivka. There, the Russians also advanced 2 kilometers along the N15 highway as well as on the 00510 road, meaning forward elements of the Russian armed forces officially started the Battle of Kurakhove for good. Yet, the initial Russian armored attacks met swift reaction by the drone operators of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade. Since the frontal attempts to capture Kurakhove failed, the Russian command tried to sneak it in from another entry point. That's how some Russian assault detachments were ordered to cross the river across rubber boats.
Quiet.
Although this small amphibious operation came at a cost, it allowed Russian forces to establish a bridgehead behind enemy lines. South of Kurakhove along the Sukhyeli River, the Russian army finalized the capture of Bohoyavlenka and now brought the battle towards Trudove. This name is definitely a bad omen. Now, if the crisis could not get worse, fighting suddenly erupted north of the reservoir in Sansivka, 4 kilometers beyond the contact line.
What are you doing here?
In this FPS experience, a Ukrainian tank of the Triti Tankovi Rota, or 3rd Tank Company of the 35th Marine Brigade, is pinning down enemy scouts that firmly entrenched themselves in the village. To do so, the tank is blasting its cannon before switching to its NSVT heavy machine gun to finish the job. Now if we zoom out, this means all these Ukrainian troops were 3.5 kilometers away from being completely encircled. One more Russian push like in Santivka and it's over. On the 10th of November, this wide Russian push from the north led the last Ukrainian troops in Kostiantynivka to withdraw. At that moment, Russian forces established a foothold inside the twin villages of Antonivka and Katerinivka. The Russian command knows very well that when you have an opportunity with twins, you just take it, because that might never happen again. Meanwhile, another 2 kilometers were gained in the fields leading to Kostiantynopolsk. On the 11th of November, Russian assault units stormed this entire 2.8 kilometer tree line. The riflemen that were disembarked were hit by an immediate Ukrainian counterattack by elements of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. In this video, we see the intervention of a Leopard 2A4 firing right into an enemy fire team at point blank, and then collabed with an M113 APC coming for round 2. The 33rd Mechanized Brigade is an elite formation, a bit like the new 47th, but that's a topic for another day. However, despite this storm of steel, it seems some forward elements of the Russian army made it inside Dalnie. Now it's important to mention that there were a lot of civilians left in the village of Dalnie by the time of the battle. The Russian command probably knew that these civilians were waiting for them, so they launched the attack on the village without any artillery preparation. This humanitarian decision would have a lot of consequences for the Russian army. Long story short, the Battle of Dalnie would be extremely difficult, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In this video, we see a column of 8 Russian armored vehicles. The leading one thinks it's all clever by releasing a smokescreen when a second later, boom, artillery strike. This frame is interesting. We see 2 Russian BMPs filled with riflemen that broke through into the village of Dalnie, plus a third one further to the left. This explains why all this part of the village was in the gray zone on the Deep State UA map. We can also analyze the trenches the Ukrainians have built. 2 bastions each with 5 firing positions connected by a communication trench. Yet I wonder if there's any underground structure or tunnel that links up these trenches with the buildings to the rear. If not, then it's a really poor design. Anyway, this set of fortifications was to prevent the Russians from attacking across the field. That explains why the Russian armored vehicles flanked the position. And by the time they got there, there were no Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches anymore. Had it been a Hollywood movie, we would have had a scene similar to the one in Fury, which makes no sense whatsoever. No, that can't be possible. Why are they doing this? And had it been a Russian war movie, you would have had dozens of men fighting in hand-to-hand combat inside the trenches. Anyway, back to the battle. The Ukrainians were about to lose this fortified village when a Leopard 2 came out of nowhere. Fired a first shot, boom, fired a couple more rounds, destroyed one of the retreating BMPs and then a second one. Let's recreate this Ukrainian counterattack using satellite imagery. Big Russian column, 2 out of 8 vehicles gone. 5 carry on the mission and capture this tree line. 3 of the BMPs reach the village and this trench network. Now the Leopard 2 arrived from this direction, destroying a first BMP at a distance of 450 meters. In turn, the other BMPs then quickly drove off. The Leopard 2 advanced up until this house with a red roof at the entrance of Dalnie. From there, the tank hit one BMP here and the other one in this direction as it tried to flee. Big Ukrainian win! No! Because Russian drone operators then tracked down that Leopard 2 and immobilized it after a couple strikes. 500,000 rubles bonus for these guys. The reason I wanted to dissect this combat action in detail was that so that you can see how complex these operations can get. It's very easy to draw an arrow towards the village of Dalnie, but it's also important to zoom in and see how it actually happens and at what cost it came. On the 11th of November as well, the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade captured the central part of Novoselidivka. In their drone footage, you can see the tragedy of Ukrainian defensive lines. There are fortifications like these dragon teeth, but they're not manned or protected by any outposts, so the Russians just pushed through. If we zoom out, the operational situation north of the reservoir was the following. Russian forces in Sontsivka, Vozhnesenka, Novoselidivka, and Ilinka. The only urban area inside this cauldron still under Ukrainian control that could act as defensive node was Berezki. The next day, despite Ukrainian counterattacks, the Russians secured this tree line intersection and were now only 1 kilometer away from Dalnie. The great shock came when Russian troops were geolocated deep inside Kurakhove, 2 kilometers beyond the front line. All we can say is that this amphibious operation clearly brought results. In turn, to prevent a complete collapse of the defense of the city, the Ukrainian command quickly dispatched reinforcements into this sector to surgically remove this abscess. But to do so, they had to cross over this swampy area using this exposed causeway. One of these attempts was stopped by Russian artillery fire, and then more artillery strikes, followed by another attempt which ended with drones chasing down this Ukrainian tank. The 13th of November was another dark day for the AFU. North of the reservoir, assault detachments of the DPR's 114th Brigade stormed Ilinka, captured some prisoners there and then raised their banner on the settlement. Meanwhile, Russian storm companies secured a definitive foothold inside Dalnie, while this other Russian grouping successfully launched this 3-kilometer dash towards the Suryali River. The Ukrainian command could absolutely not let the two tips touch, because that would be so grave. Because of the danger of this double penetration, the next day on the 14th of November, the Ukrainians abandoned Antonivka. That's right, one of the two twins. 24 hours later, we could witness this general step-by-step retrograde maneuver from both these pockets. From a tactical perspective, after Ilinka, the 114th Brigade consolidated a foothold inside Berezki, a village sitting just across Kurakhove. Fast forward to the 18th. North of the reservoir, a third of Berezki was now under Russian control. Further south, the battle for Dalnie continued. It was a very difficult fight, with lots of back and forth. Here, another Leopard 2 tank struck at an advancing Russian column. Meanwhile, drones harassed Russian infantry squads that were being disembarked into the village. We could also witness a large gray zone east of Dalnie. The entire pocket was clearly under heavy pressure. If Dalnie fell into Russian hands, then the command of the AFU would only have a couple hours to pull out all its troops. While this battle was taking place, Russian forces were already in the process of storming Trudove. In this video, you can see drone footage of what the settlement looks like. As most farm villages in the region, it's pretty small and only has a couple streets. By the 19th of November, the Ukrainians retreated 2.6 kilometers in this direction, 1.4 kilometer in this one, and 1.6 kilometer in this one. Further north, beyond the reservoir, Russian forces took full control of Berezki. Can you guess who raised their flag? That's right, the 114th Brigade of the DPR. 24 hours later, the pressure got too intense in Dalnie. Entire Russian fire teams of stormtroopers inundated the village, chasing down the last enemy troops still present in the vicinity, before raising their colors on the settlement. It took 10 days, 10 difficult days of fighting for the Russian army to capture The small village of Dalnie, the efforts of the Ukrainian 33rd Mechanized Brigade paid off, because their counterattacks managed to significantly slow down the Russian advance. 10 days that allowed Ukraine to withdraw all its forces from this pocket in relative good order. From the Russian perspective, now that Dalnie and all the trench networks around were theirs, meant that they would greatly benefit from this strategic central position. From there they could strike north, west, or south, all the while being able to house hundreds of troops. On top of that, the distance between Dalnie and Uspenivka was only 3 kilometers. One more push and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers would be trapped. North of the reservoir in Santsivka, the battle was also very difficult. Neither side could get the upper hand. There the Russians attacked with a combination of tanks and very light vehicles like buggies, a tactic which often ended up in a lot of burnt steel. Otherwise, forward elements of the 5th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade reached this area of Kurakhove with a causeway over the swampy ground. That's where they raised the Russian white-blue-red flag. There was also this new flag belonging to the 5th Brigade Oblast, which quotes Taras Bulba, "Nietu svatviej tovarychestva." There is no bond more sacred than comradeship. Now in regards to this 5th Brigade, Russian Telegram channel Slatkov revealed there are data on the arrest and removal of commanders and commanding officers from high positions. We don't know exactly why though. It's also interesting for me to see the large role played by DPR regiments and brigades in this entire campaign. I think it's definitely worth looking into for a future video how these former separatist contingents were reorganized into the Russian armed forces, and see what role they play in this war in 2025. On the 21st of November, Russian forces made gains all over the Kurakhove sector, including the full capture of Dalnie, now officialized by pro-Ukrainian deep state UA. In this footage you can see 4 Ukrainian soldiers that were captured by the enemy. And here you can see soldiers of the 102nd Motor Rifle Regiment, 150th Division raising the Russian flag on the western edge of the village. We spoke about 2 dark days for the AFU, but the real L for Ukraine took place on the 23rd of November. As you can see on the map, the pocket just collapsed. The Russians attacked from 3 directions. And everything happened so fast that now some Ukrainian troops were stuck in Katerinivka, while others were stranded in the neighboring Yelizavetivka. Like I mentioned before, although on the map we show big arrows, in reality it's a multitude of small units that broke through. Like this attack led by men of the 1st Company of the Kozma Minin Battalion of the 10th Tank Regiment from Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, which landed troops kilometers behind enemy lines. The path was opened by a T-80 BVM tank manned by the crew composed of call signs Student, Khudozhnik, and Khalsky. Behind them, 2 infantry fighting vehicles followed closely. As the tank withdrew, the 2 BMPs disembarked their infantry component before heading back. Fun fact, the battalion is called the Kuzma Minin because of a historical figure and hero of Nizhny Novgorod, who started an uprising against Polish-Lithuanian forces during the times of troubles in the early 17th century. You probably saw him in this famous Russian painting where he's depicted on the left. On the 24th of November, the last remnants of the AFU retreated from Katerinivka, but they were already getting chased down by Russian armored columns which overran the next line of defense. In this video you can see 3 armored vehicles blasting at Ukrainian positions while pressing forward. After which, they spread out. 1 wreaks hell against this building, 1 stayed behind in reserve, and the 3rd one continued further. Then they all dropped their riflemen right into some of the buildings. Here you have a 3-man team clearing this underground position, while another 2 cleared the trench before heading to this hangar. This vehicle disembarked a storm unit of 4 men. As the assault continued, more and more infantry teams were landed into the village. As you can see, much more sophisticated than the so-called meat wave attacks. What we see instead is how Russian vehicles insert small tactical units at every corner of the village. This led to a number of Ukrainian units to be all of a sudden surrounded. The ones that were lucky could fight their way out. But for the others, these Ukrainian soldiers decided to barricade themselves in this bunker, which was soon to be visited by some orcs. I feel bad for these troops because, knowing the AFU, I have the feeling these guys were recently mobilized personnel that were just sacrificed in order to let the more experienced troops and heavy weapons retreat in good order. In Kurakhove, all the troops withdrew to the western side of the city. North of the reservoir, the pocket collapsed after a triple attack. One thrust towards Sontsivka, one push out of Vozhnesenka, and another out of Ilinka. The last one was led by an assault detachment of the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment. In this footage, 2 of the riflemen inspect some abandoned trenches. Then they run across the no man's land towards this bunker. As they approach, they receive fire. In the end, they successfully storm and clear this position. Meanwhile, 2 of their buddies clear a communication trench while wearing some sort of infrared camouflage poncho to prevent being discovered by enemy drones. On the 25th of November, with this pocket under heavy pressure, Russian units started pushing westwards in order to use their momentum and prevent Ukrainians from reforming their lines. In Kurakhove proper, it was the 5th Brigade Oplot of the DPR that was leading the charge. The same unit that stormed Krasnoarivka. Here you can see how the front evolved between the 26th and the 29th of November. This pocket was once again getting squished. In Kurakhove, Russian forces captured 1 square kilometer of the western part of the city. And north of the reservoir, storm units of the 114th Brigade raised their banner on Berezhki. On the last day of November, these same guys also advanced another 2 kilometers along the reservoir up to Stary Terny. Meanwhile, friendly forces advanced 1 kilometer south of Kurakhove. At the tip of the pocket, the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment also raised its banner on Ilinka. Throughout November, the Russian army advanced 12 kilometers south of Kurakhove. The AFU lost 3/4 of the residential area of Kurakhove and had to prevent once again this cauldron from being cut off and encircled. The positive part for Ukraine is that the situation could have been much worse. They skillfully managed to withdraw the bulk of their forces one step at a time while stalling the Russians for an entire month. December 2024. On the 2nd of December, north of the reservoir, Russian forces reached Stary Terny, thus threatening Ukrainian army units in this cauldron, but also possibly cutting off Kurakhove from the rear. With that being said, such an assault would be extremely complicated, since the Russians would have to attack along a 1,400-meter causeway fully exposed.
What, we some kind of suicide squad?
By the 3rd of December, Russia gained more ground in Kurakhove in this gritty street-by-street, house-to-house fighting. Here you can see a video of this city recorded from the perspective of a Ukrainian soldier. The big event of the day was this 4-kilometer charge all the way towards the village of Sukhyali. Meanwhile, another grouping got a foothold inside Kostiantynopolsk, using numerous armored columns. The 4th of December was laundry day for the Russians, since all they did was mopping up. Most of Stary Terny was captured, same for Kostiantynopolsk, Sukhyali and Yelizavetivka. There was only one road out, and enemy forces had already entered Romanivka, so you had this small cauldron leading into this bigger one. Even worse, the bridge between Kostiantynopolsk and Sukhyali was heavily damaged by Russian artillery, thus making a quick withdrawal extremely complicated. The 5th of December was yet another of these dark days for Ukraine. From Dalnie, the Russians charged 2.5 kilometers, with some of their forward elements reaching the outskirts of Uspenivka.
Another fuck up. Another fuck up.
Here you can see some of the troops that called the first touchdown. During this time, most of Romanivka fell under control of the 242nd Motor Rifle Regiment of the 8th Russian Army. The situation quickly turned dramatic for the AFU. The Ukrainians could either use this road to retreat, but now the Russians were right there in Uspenivka, or they could use this one. But it was also blocked in Kostiantynopolsk, which was also getting mopped up by the orcish janitors. My friends, it seems after the shovel, the new weapon of choice of the Russian army is the mop. In this video, you can see a 6-man storm unit preparing to storm these buildings. The remaining 4 men of the squad attacked from the flanks, leading the remaining Ukrainian soldiers to quickly Usain Bolt their way out. Essentially, for the AFU in this sector, the only way to escape was across open fields in this direction. By the 11th of December, the situation was getting catastrophic. However, disaster was avoided after the quick counterattack of the 505th Marine Battalion, which knocked out Russian troops from the village of Kostiantynopolsk. This action more or less stabilized the situation, as it reopened one exit for this entire Ukraine grouping. As you can see in this footage, this counterattack involved a task force equipped with heavy weapons, led this tank from the 214th Up 4 Assault Battalion, and this British Mastiff MRAP. This intervention allowed some much needed breathing room for Ukrainian forces. The withdrawal was covered by constant drone strikes on advancing Russian detachments day and night. Meanwhile, it's the Ukrainian pocket north of the reservoir that got cold and shrunk by 50%. The following day, on the 12th of December, Russian troops pushed 2 kilometers along these two tree lines and were now just outside Vesely High. What a disaster for the AFU. The Russians had effectively chopped up this cauldron into multiple smaller pieces, meaning it was nearly impossible for these Ukrainian soldiers to escape. In the Kurakhove city center, the Ukrainian 46th Air Mobile Brigade was fighting tooth and nail for every block. Every step they conceded came at a great cost for the enemy. North of the reservoir, Santsivka and Zoria eventually fell into enemy hands. Not only the AFU had very little reserves available, but the arrival of reinforcements was constantly delayed, meaning some forward outposts had no other choice but to be abandoned. In this footage, a Ukrainian M113 APC is followed by a drone, which then guides artillery fire once the riflemen had disembarked from the vehicle. Fast forward to the 18th of December. The AFU finally withdrew all its forces from the pocket south of Dalnie. First by ordering all the remnants of Ukrainian units towards Hanivka and then towards Uspenivka before being able to escape from the trap. In this footage you can see Russian soldiers of the 255th Regiment clearing Uspenivka before waving the white-blue-red banner on the settlement. In a nearby village, some Ukrainian troops got stranded inside this house but refused to surrender. So Russian sappers ran with explosive charges and just detonated the building. It's pretty tragic if you ask me. It's not like in war movies where these guys will fall after an epic last stand taking out dozens of enemies. Nope, the building was just destroyed. Now a new cauldron was forming with Russian forces back in Konstantinopolsk but also in Sukhyali and Zelenivka. In this last settlement, 9 Ukrainian soldiers were reportedly captured, followed by Russian troops waving the imperial flag. In Kurakhove, Russian assault detachments of the 110th Brigade of the DPR managed to turn enemy defenses and almost encircled the troops positioned in the city center. The gap was only 300 meters wide. During this push, their comrades, the stormtroopers of the 5th Brigade, removed the Ukrainian flags in the Kurakhove's administration center and replaced them with their own. There they also captured 4 Ukrainian soldiers. As you can see on the map, now this entire neighborhood was getting encircled. Now some of the most intense firefights were taking place in this sector, like here on the raiding FPV drones, with no possibility to retreat. This Russian infantry squad saw no other option but to charge and storm this commie block. Facing encirclement in small groups, Ukrainian units retreated towards friendly lines. But this came at a risk of being spotted and then hammered by enemy drones. By the 23rd of December, Russian army units effectively captured the entire southern bank of the Sukhyali River. From an operational perspective, the Russians trapped the AFU in yet another 22-kilometer cauldron. 25th of December, a couple more gains for Russia near Kurakhove, followed by more Russian flags being raised. By the 28th, Russian armored columns pushed 3 kilometers from Stariterny towards the first houses of Shevchenko. There, the Ukrainians tried to carry out a hit-and-run fire mission with a Leopard 1A5, but it got ambushed by a couple enemy FPV drones. Inside Kurakhove, some Ukrainian troops were still holding this neighborhood near the crossroad while another was effectively surrounded downtown. The fact that these units resisted so long probably means there were some special forces detachments that are very well versed in urban warfare. As you can see on the map, 24 hours later, on the 29th of December, Russian armed forces made a lot of gains. The Ukrainians had retreated from this pocket near Santsivka. Shevchenko had basically fallen. The Russians cleared this pocket in downtown Kurakhove and pushed 900 meters westwards. At last, they advanced 1.5 kilometers all across the southern part of the Kurakhove front. If we zoom in on one of these red arrows, at the tip of the spear, we see a Russian assault team of 3 men clearing a trench in the middle of nowhere. To secure their attack, they're throwing grenades at every corner. Unbeknown to them, there is a Ukrainian drone hovering right above their heads. The grenades that were dropped eliminated 2 out of 3 of these Russian soldiers. They were KIA. The last one was severely wounded. He looked up and knew immediately what was about to happen. So before the drone could get him, he quickly grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, and held it to his chest. What a tragedy, really, what a tragedy. In a last-ditch attempt to save this cauldron, the AFU threw in units of the newly built 155th Andokiev Mechanized Brigade, and it did absolutely nothing. On the last day of December, Russian assault detachments once again pushed 2 kilometers westward inside Kurakhove. Retreating Ukrainian units were continuously harassed by Russian drones, ambushing them with grenades. In the end, Russian army units captured most of the residential sectors of the city, which they celebrated by raising their colors. January 2025. The Russian army, just like the average Joe, likes to celebrate the new year with a good bang. The recon detachments pushed 2,000 meters inside this industrial area until the western edge of Kurakhove.
They now control a key position, my lord!
Like in a parallel motion, Russian forces also pushed all the way to this line, but across the field south of the city. The next day, on the 2nd of January, the last Ukrainian troops escaped from the Santsivka pocket. Using this momentum, some detachments of this damned 114th Motor Rifle Brigade managed to get a foothold inside Petropavlivka. In this video, you can see one of these detachments before they get targeted by enemy drones. As for this cauldron, a Ukrainian T-72 went for a fire mission before being detected by enemy drones, and was later destroyed 3.5 kilometers from the contact line. By the 4th of January, Russian forces advanced 300 meters in Shevchenko, 200 meters in the industrial area of Kurakhove, and mopped up this entire 6 square kilometer area. The next day, Russian assault units consolidated their hold on Petropavlivka and now controlled half the settlement. On January 6, on Orthodox Christmas Eve, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced the full capture of the city of Kurakhove. The Russian army's offensive north of the reservoir was also in full swing, with 3 spearheads pushing full west via Slavianka, Petropavlivka, and Shevchenko. Barely 48 hours later, most of Slavianka and Petropavlivka had been mopped up, as well as the fields south of the industrial area. The Battle of Kurakhove was effectively over. Since then, the Russians barely made any gains on this new cauldron now centered on Dalnie. That was the situation on the 8th of January, and this is how the front evolved now 1 week later on the 16th.
Not great or terrible.
It seems they prefer to put their attention on striking these 2 villages of Andrivka and Konstantinopil, which would effectively force this entire grouping out of the cauldron. Overall, although Ukraine lost a lot of ground in the urban area of Kurakhove, quite frankly, the situation could have been worse for the AFU. They prevented a complete collapse of their positions and avoided so many encirclements. They also stalled this wide Russian offensive in the South Donetsk Oblast for nearly 2 months. Really, we can say it, hats off to whoever commanded this Ukrainian grouping. After this area of Andrivka and Konstantinopil is mopped up, the Russian army will probably attack all these trench networks and bastions head-on to pin down as many Ukrainian forces there, while the troops north and south of the Vovcha River launch a large-scale envelopment maneuver. And you guessed it, to create yet another cauldron for the Ukrainians to escape from. A new battle which will culminate with Russian forces entering Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're into this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.